Hello. This is the summary of my second week of dev streams, and this time it will be less macro in the sense that I'm recording all the commentary in between streams to simply avoid crunching on one day and recording all the stuff, editing all the stuff, and I'm just optimizing my cortisol gain. Just a reminder, my Twitch channel is in the description and I stream on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays at 15 of Central European time, as well as on Saturdays later on 19 or 20. Any exceptions to that I inform on my Discord server, link also in description. Let's get to the summary. I began the Monday stream extremely tired, because I was recording and editing the previous summary for the entire Sunday as well as my morning. So because of that, instead of getting to coding, I decided I will relax myself modeling a simple low poly gun. How will we call this gun? Suggest some name, chat. John. I could find one on Sketchfab or wherever, but I decided I'll make my simple one and have some slight relaxation while doing that. Anyway, before we head to summarize what I was coding that day, let's just quickly revise what I changed in between streams. One thing I changed for certain was these exceptions. I also added a small change to the time delay after the burst sequence, so it's not prolonged and it will be easier to later configure weapons. And that's actually it for the changes. Now let's get to the interesting stuff. I began with planning out how to handle the display of the weapon. By that I mean, how do we control the model, its animations, as well as any other logic that's tied to the view, like sound slider or any other stuff. I quickly scratched something up in Paint and I got this idea. We take this gun view object in the hierarchy of the player and we'll promote it from just being a transform to a special class that will handle the creation and destruction of the underlying weapon model, as well as scheduling all its animations and passing all relevant data to it. As of now, it's not implemented yet to anything different, but I can see how it can later turn to also change the position of the weapon so that we can visually aim sights. So I made the two classes, the weapon center, which will be applied to the gun view, as well as the model controller, which will be the control panel for the model. And along with them, I made some subtle changes to some details in the system just to make it more suitable. I then sketched a general diagram for the animations, and this is the point when this day went into a giant rabbit hole. This is because I began to implement reload. And I had two options. Either make a lazy kind of reload, where you press reload and it reloads and you can't do anything about it, or you do a civilized reload, where you can not only pause in between, but also have variety, like partially loading your gun in the fashion of marksman weapons or some shotguns in games. And the thing is, the first option was lightning fast to do, but the second one is a lot of work. And this work would take over this entire week. Now, this is not the rabbit hole I'm talking about. The rabbit hole in question is that I began to work on multiple things related to reload simultaneously, and it fried my brain circuits. Those things in question are the mechanism for reloading itself, that is the macro mechanism of how it is called, what is the coroutine is, and other stuff, as well as the very calculation for reload, which ultimately this day was just briefly introduced, and I will wrestle with it on Wednesday. Now, working on the coroutine for reloading introduced some additional areas of thought, like updating the coroutines to actually be able to be cancelled. And I had to learn how cancellation tokens work because I never worked with them before. And also I noticed that my burst coroutine was incomplete because it also didn't stop, and this coroutine should actually stop, like when you're running out of bullets mid-burst. So the things I was ultimately doing with code on Monday was constructing the entire coroutine for the reload and updating the coroutine runner, as well as introducing the idea how to handle the portioned reload. And let's actually talk about the latter first. Technically, in the weapon data, I could introduce simply two fields like bow is portioned, as well as int size of the portion. But I got a different idea, to cram them into one and use a nullable int for it. A nullable type is basically just this type, except that it can also be null. Because by default, when you have an integer or a float, you can't make them null, you can at most make them 0. Now, for my case, it wasn't the best idea to do it like that. I could just do a bool and an int, and it would be perfectly fine. I would have to just write two different things in my script. But I decided to do that nonetheless. I later had to create a custom class for displaying this value later in the inspector, since Unity by default doesn't display nullable types in the inspector, and so I just made some more work for myself. As for the reload coroutine, the final overall shape looks something like this. First, we set the reloading flag in weapon handler so that later we can use it for input checks in the main state. Then we check which reload to perform. If we do a full reload, we simply do one cycle and we're done. If our reload is portioned, then we do a while loop and we consecutively repeat the cycles until we run out of ammo or our clip is full. Finally, we release the flag and the reload is done. Now to cancel the reload we have two ways. One is a soft reload, which is to be used only in the portioned reload. And this is simply a boolean flag, which we can use to break the while loop. The second way is via the cancellation token. In the main state, we can externally order the token to cancel, and then in the coroutine we can order it to throw if we requested a cancellation. Since the token can throw in both the full and portion scenario, we simply take the entire thing in a try block, then we can catch the operation cancelled exception and do some eventual cleanup, and finally we finish the reload and release the coroutine. Day 6 was a weird one. I was very sleepy that day. It was hot, and in result, I was doing a lot of weird small stuff, a lot of nothings in general, and you'll see in a moment. So the first noteworthy thing, I made a reload input action and hooked it in the input manager. I then added a very small change to the input manager itself. I made a general purpose invoke method, so I don't have to write a similar method for both the reload, the press fire, and whatever I will do later. One thing I didn't care to do anything about though was to fix the subscription and unsubscription of the lambda expressions in input manager. I left it to do that another day, but I went to do a very similar fix, in fact the same fix, just much smaller in scale. That was the lambdas in the main state. I actually was fixing that earlier after the Monday stream, but on Wednesday I saw that actually my fix was still wrong, and so a couple of minutes with ChatGPT later and it was properly set up, and I also hooked the reload input automatically while doing that. I would later jump back to this handle reload method a few times. Nonetheless, another small but important change was to make the player context a field in the main state, so I wouldn't have to pass it through an argument to each method in the class, and instead it would be just normally accessible. This field would be assigned on construction, and that would save a lot of hassle. I also realized I've done this a bit incorrectly, because since player context is a class that is generically used by the state and state machine, I could instead simply add the context to the state interface, and this way I could access the context anyway in each state without specifically stating it for each single one. But this change is yet to be done. Another change I've done was in the try shoot method, which is called in the burst coroutine, when we want to test if we are going to shoot or we're going to fail because of black ammo or something. I removed any reference to reload in it. I have to figure out how to trigger reload automatically later. For now, it will simply pause. And in terms of pausing, I changed the cancel mode of burst from the cancellation token model to simply a flag, since it's simpler and in this case it's more appropriate. Later I was jumping on doing various kind of stuff, mainly nothing that I would never use. And one in particular example is that I was coding attenuation classes, body charge attenuation, reload time attenuation, damage over range attenuation, and so on. So I wanted to do it myself. I wanted to make a abstract class from which I could code some specific shapes and then use them because I was stubborn and yeah, it took a lot of time. And in the end, I gave up and just used animation curves, which Unity provides, which is a much more elegant solution, much more configurable. And yeah, wasted a lot of time. Just as I implemented the animation curves, I immediately hooked one of them into the reload delay logic, so at least it's partially fair. I also added a very small thing which I overlooked somehow earlier, and that was a simple recoil motion. Not a nice fluid thing, just a sudden snap when you're clicking. Alright, now is the time I mentioned. This already infamous hour of programming the reload function. Long story short, my brain was already fried that day. It had no trace of cleverness left. So I was considering reloading in scenarios. And I made this 50-line extremely branching monster. When I was finally done with it, I sent it to ChatGPT. Check if I haven't skipped anything and whether it works. And it turned out it was not only wrong, it was also highly suboptimal. Just for contrast, this is my method. This is my method. And this is what ChatGPT suggested. Ah! So, yeah, because of that humiliation and the fact that I was extremely tired from it, I decided to end the stream an hour earlier. And so that was day 6. On Friday, I was supposed to work on weapon animations and in general the visuals and getting a footing in how all of this fits in my architecture and finally work on some gameplay later. But instead of that, I spent the entire day on fixing errors, correcting the weapon handler, as well as working on a simple HUD. First, I began the day with pressing play in Unity for the first time in this week, and it started to spit out errors. And so the first, I guess, hour of the stream was a marathon of error solving. These errors included problems with lambdas, the construction of order of the state machine, because somehow it was instantiated earlier than the input manager, null checking the weapons. And by the way, this third one led me to fix the methods in weapon handler pick weapon and set weapon, since their logic was slightly wrong, and that was most of the actual code part. So after that, I slightly reconstructed the player object. I've specifically added an overlay camera, which would capture the display of our weapons separately so it doesn't clip visually through any walls or whatever. I then slightly rearranged the hierarchy of the player-child objects, and then I went to work on the HUD. I made the HUD in UI Toolkit, which thankfully I had some experience with, because if I was working with it for the first time that day, I would be pulling my hair so much I would get bald. UI Toolkit is a strange tool which is completely unintuitive, but has a lot of nice features, and in general you can achieve much more than the old Yugui could do. After making the HUD, I quickly rearranged the weapon center so that it looks a bit more realistic. Then I proceeded to code the functionality for the HUD. For this purpose, I imported a UI handler class from my other project, which was specifically made for the UI toolkit. This is an abstract class which can be inherited to create a very easy chunk of code to fit for any UI you got. Even though this base is simple, the overall process for displaying the stuff I wanted, that is the current ammo, the carried ammo, tabs for weapons, and their proper refreshing, was a bit of a hassle, and it took the last third of the stream time. Mostly due to problems with how to hook up which thing with what parameters to pass, how to pass them, what to keep in the UI doc, what to not keep in the UI doc, and in general, a bit of overthinking extended this process. And that would be it for this week. I won't comment on Saturday, since on Saturday I wasn't doing anything related to the project, I was just making some music, so it doesn't fit a summary of dev streams. Any reflections for this week? Well, I should work more, because in this week I've done basically nothing. Also, as I said at the beginning, the plan was to edit and record after the streams, either directly or days in between, but, well, I got lazy and I again had to crunch a bit, though a bit less. Currently it's 10:30 p.m. and yeah, I still have to add all the visualizations of what I was talking about, and I expect that again, I'll have to upload this on Monday and edit a lot before the stream. So yeah, not good. That's the lesson for you kids. Don't be lazy. You can see it by how I summarized Friday. My voice overall was getting quite low, and I kind of glossed over again. So to be honest, I couldn't find a way to add more detail to the Friday day. So anyway, thanks for watching. Let's hope the next week is more productive.